Have you ever heard of Silvo do Maogia? I always thought these stories were the stuff of superstitious people, something invented to scare children or idle people. But after what happened to me, I never doubted it again. It was a Wednesday. I remember it well. I had gone to visit my grandfather, who lived in a remote place in the countryside. He always told us to avoid lunchtime in the countryside, especially near the woods. That's when the world goes silent, he said, and in the silence, the bad thing appears. I laughed at that. It was just an excuse to keep us in the house during the heat. That day, after lunch, I decided to go out to pick some mangoes from the orchard. The sun was shining, noon on the dot. Everything seemed normal. The birds had stopped singing, but I wasn't surprised. Sometimes they did that. The silence was almost comforting, until I heard it. A whistle. It was long, continuous, and seemed to be coming from the trees, not far from where I was. At the time, I thought it was funny. Is there anyone there? I thought. Maybe some neighbor or a hunter who was playing with me. Who's there? I shouted, laughing. The sound stopped for a moment. That heavy silence returned, but then he started again. Higher, closer. I felt a shiver down my spine. Something about the sound didn't seem natural. It wasn't a human whistle. It was very clear, very perfect, almost mechanical, as if nature itself was calling. I stopped where I was, holding the sleeve I had just picked up. My grandfather had once said, "If you hear the whistle, don't look. Don't look. Just follow your path." I wanted to believe that it was just a coincidence, but my curiosity was greater. I looked. The sound came from the middle of the orchard. I looked toward the trees, and what I saw, I'll never forget. Between the trunks, where the sunlight barely touched the ground, there was a shadow. Not a person, not an animal. It was just a shadow, dark, deep, that seemed to breathe along with the sound of the whistle. Suddenly, the shadow moved, not like something walking, but like it was dissolving into the air, approaching me. The hissing became sharper, louder, and seemed to go straight through my ears and into my chest. I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know what it was. I just ran as fast as I could back to my grandfather's house. When I arrived, he was on the porch, waiting for me. Before I could even say anything, he shook his head and said, "You looked, didn't you?" I didn't ask how he knew. I didn't tell you what I saw. I just went into the house and stayed there until the sun went down. I never went back to the orchard at noon. The silence at that time gives me goosebumps to this day. I don't know what that whistle was, but I know I never want to hear it again. If you hear it, my advice is, don't look. My name is Joao, but everyone in my city knows me as Joazinho dos Entregas. I spent most of my life working as a delivery boy in a small village in the countryside. The streets were quiet, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone. But at night, things got weird. Everyone avoided going out after the sun went down, and I found out why in the worst way possible. The story of the bagman was one of the first we heard as children. According to legend, he was a large man, with shabby clothes, a burlap sack on his back, and a blank stare that chilled the spine. They said he went around the villages, kidnapping disobedient children to put them in the sack. Some returned days later, too scared to tell what they had seen. Others simply never came back. I never believed this story. To me, it was just a story invented by parents to make their children stay quiet. Until the night everything changed. It was a Friday, and I had one last delivery to make before calling it a day. The request was for a remote house on the edge of the village, close to a thicket. The sun had already disappeared over the horizon, and I was cycling quickly to get there soon. The night was eerily silent, and the air felt colder than usual. When I passed the last lit street, I heard a strange sound coming from the woods. It was like a heavy shuffle, followed by slow footsteps. I stopped the bike and looked in the direction of the sound, but I didn't see anything. It's just the wind, I thought, trying to ignore the shiver that crept up the back of my neck. I continued pedaling, but the sound seemed to follow me. With every turn I made, I felt like someone was watching me. When I finally arrived at the house, I left the delivery at the gate and clapped. Nobody responded. I decided to go back quickly, but that's when I saw it. On the side of the road, in the dim light of a streetlight, he stood. It was exactly as the stories said. A tall man with a hunched posture, holding a heavy bag on his back. He was standing still, looking at me. I couldn't see his face properly, but his eyes glowed in the darkness. My instinct was to run away, but my feet were frozen. He started walking towards me, dragging the bag along the floor. The sound was horrible, like something rough scraping on gravel. "Did you see?" he said, in a hoarse, drawling voice. I didn't know what he meant, but panic took over me. I got on the bike and pedaled with all my might. I could hear the dragging of the bag behind me, getting closer and closer. When I finally entered the village, the sound disappeared. Since that night, I have never made late-night deliveries again. And to this day, when I hear the sound of something being dragged, I feel that same shiver and remember the eyes that stared at me in the darkness. If you hear about the bagman, my advice is simple. Don't stay to find out what's inside the bag. My name is Daniel, and I have worked as a truck driver for years. I've heard many bizarre stories about the road, but the one that struck me most was the night I saw something I'll never be able to forget. The grinning man, or as many call him, the man with the wide smile. I always thought these stories were absurd, invented by people who were tired or wanted to scare others, until it happened to me. It was a rainy night, and I was driving in a deserted stretch of countryside in West Virginia, in the United States. The road was wet, and the fog made it difficult to see far ahead. My radio had stopped working hours before, and the silence was broken only by the sound of the tires in the water and the engine rumbling low. Everything seemed normal, until, as I went around a curve, I saw a figure in the distance, on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was someone in need of help, maybe a lost pedestrian. As I got closer, I noticed he was a tall man wearing a dark suit who looked impeccably dry despite the rain. He was standing still, looking at the road. As I passed him, something caught my attention. His face. He had a wide, very wide, almost impossible smile. It wasn't a friendly smile. It looked forced, like his face was stuck in that expression. His eyes, fixed, followed me as the truck passed. My heart raced, but I tried to calm down. It must just be a strange man, I thought. But after a few kilometers, something made me freeze. As I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw the same figure on the side of the road again. It was impossible. I had already driven miles since I first saw him. How could he be there, at the same distance? I sped up, trying to ignore it. But it wasn't long before I saw him again, this time stopped on the side of the road, even closer. He didn't move. He did nothing but stare at me with that disturbing smile. When I looked in the rearview mirror again, he was there, standing in the middle of the road, as if he was watching me drive away. Finally, I decided to stop at a gas station, close to the next town. I was sweating cold, and my mind was racing. I bought a coffee and tried to distract myself, but I couldn't get that picture out of my head. When I got back to the truck, I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the windshield, there were finger marks, as if someone had passed their hand there, drawing slowly. The smile. A rudimentary drawing of a face with a wide smile was there, traced in the dirt on the glass. Since that night, I have avoided driving alone in very isolated areas. I don't know what that man was, but I'm sure he wasn't human. The grinning man is not just a legend. He's out there, waiting. And if you cross paths with him, my advice is simple. Don't stop, don't stare, and never respond to his smile. When my grandmother was young, she lived in a small town, surrounded by forests and dirt roads. It was the kind of place where people knew each other, and stories of hauntings traveled fast. But nothing was more feared than the lady in white. They said that she appeared on the banks of a road near the river, always at night. She was wearing a long white dress, which seemed to shine under the moonlight, and her face was covered by a veil or her hair. It was common for residents to avoid going through that stretch alone, especially after the sun went down. Legend said that the lady in white was the spirit of a young woman who had been betrayed by her fiancé on her wedding day. Upon discovering the betrayal, she ran to the river and took her own life, still dressed as a bride. Her spirit never found peace, and she was trapped in that place, wandering in search of revenge or the soul of the man who betrayed her. My grandmother told me about a man named Augusto, who was skeptical and loved to make fun of these stories. He had a habit of returning home late, and he didn't believe that that road was cursed. Just fantasies, he said. One night, upon returning from the neighboring city, Augusto decided to take a shortcut along the river road. It was late, and the darkness was heavy. His only company was the light of the flashlight he carried and the sound of his own footsteps. He was already halfway there when he saw her. A woman was standing on the side of the road, wearing a white dress that seemed to almost float. Augusto thought it was someone in need of help and approached. "Girl, are you okay?" he asked. The woman didn't respond, just slowly turned her head towards him. When their eyes met, Augusto froze. She had no expression. His eyes were deep, empty, and instead of a smile, there was something like eternal pain. Suddenly, she began to move, not walking, but sliding towards him. Augusto dropped the flashlight and ran as fast as he could. They say that when he arrived at the village, he was pale and could barely speak. After that day, Augusto never returned to the river road, and he wasn't the only one to see it. Other residents reported similar encounters, and in every case, those who dared to look directly into the face of the lady in white carried the terror with them for the rest of their lives. My grandmother always said, "If you hear about the lady in white, don't laugh, and if you see her, never look directly at her." The lady in white is a reminder that the past does not rest easily, and the stories we hear have some truth to them. My name is Haruto, and I grew up hearing scary stories in Japan. But among them all, one in particular has always chilled my spine. The legend of Kayako Seki, the woman who became the symbol of hatred and revenge. It was said that anyone who entered the house where Kayako died would be cursed. She would appear as a pale figure with long, disheveled hair, wearing a white nightgown, and emitting a disturbing sound, something between a moan and a guttural snore. If you heard that sound, it was already too late. The curse was upon you, and Kayako would not rest until her life was destroyed. I never believed these stories. To me, they were just stories made up to scare children. But everything changed the day a group of friends challenged me to enter the famous Kayako's house. It was an old house in an isolated neighborhood of Tokyo. The windows were covered in dust, and the wooden walls creaked in the wind. Some said that the Seki, the family that lived there, were found dead under mysterious circumstances, and that Kayako, the mother, was brutally murdered by her husband. His spirit, consumed by hatred, remained in the house, cursing anyone who dared enter. That night, armed with the courage and shame to refuse the challenge, I decided to go there with two friends, Yuto and Akiko. As we crossed the gate, the air felt colder, as if the place itself was rejecting our presence. When we entered, the floor creaked with every step, and the musty smell was almost unbearable. But what bothered me most was the silence, a heavy silence, which seemed to vibrate in the ears. We went up the stairs, which led to the room where, according to legend, Kayako was murdered. The place was empty, except for an old cardboard box in the corner. Curious. We approached. That's when we heard it for the first time. That sound. It was low at first, almost imperceptible, but it soon became clear. A hoarse, slurred sound, as if someone was trying to breathe while choking. Akiko held my arm. That's not funny, Haruto. What did you do? I hadn't done anything. The sound seemed to come from inside the house, as if it were all around us. So we saw, at the top of the stairs, a figure began to form. First, the long black hair, falling over a pale face. Then, the dark eyes, fixed on us, as if they were accusing us. Kayako. She moved erratically, dragging her body downward, emitting that horrible guttural sound. We tried to run, but the front door was locked. The last thing I remember was Yuto's scream as she approached. When I woke up, I was outside the house, alone. I never saw Yuto or Akiko again. The police investigated but found nothing other than our shoes in the driveway. Since then, I've heard that sound at night, especially when I'm alone. No matter where I go, Kayako always seems to be nearby. If you hear the sound of Kayako, remember, there is no escape. She is the personification of hate, and her curse never ends.